Hey everyone, and good morning. Welcome to today's broadcast. I'm so excited to have so many of you here. I'm going to give folks a chance to join us before we get started. If you are just tuning in, be sure to say hello in the chat box. It's always great to see who's here. I'll also be leaving time for questions to talk about some of your productivity issues and chat a little bit more about that. So feel free to leave those questions there in the chat box. Those as we go along. So welcome to this broadcast about how to plan for a productive month of fundraising. My name is Vanessa Lockshin, and I am really excited to talk about this subject today. I'm sure, like many of you, I would say, on and off struggled with productivity in my fundraising work, and sometimes it's easier than others. It comes with its own challenges. And I'm really looking forward today to just talking about some of the challenges, the common challenges really that come up in this type of work that we do, and also share some strategies that I really hope can help you in your monthly planning and also just in your day-to-day work. So as we get started here, I would love for you to say hello in the chat, introduce yourself. It's always great to see who's tuning in. We'll get started here in just a few minutes. So just wait for everyone to join us, which is always great. All right, well, as we're waiting to get started, I want to talk about just kind of the challenges we face in our productivity sometimes in fundraising. So I would say a general fact of our work is that being productive isn't always a piece of cake, right? It's not easy for us to be productive 24/7 or to always get everything done that needs to get done. There's inevitably challenges that come up in our work, things we need to address, phone calls we need to return, meetings we have to attend, all of those things, right? And so one of the things that I think is very helpful to do as, your own productivity and figuring out, how can you change things for yourself is to just kind of spend some time reflecting on what are some of the common barriers that come up for you in an average week. What are the things that come up that prevent you from getting to your most important tasks, to getting your work done that needs to get done for that week? And I'm sure there's probably some recurring themes. And if you'd like to share yours in the chat box, that would be great. It's always good to see what some of yours are as well. I would say some of the common ones that I hear from my clients and my students are things like they have too many meetings. There's just a lot of demands for their time. They have to be in meetings. And so that eats into their schedule and prevents them from being able to get to some of these other more important tasks. I also hear a lot that there's kind of just this demand on us from our inboxes. We feel like we have to be answering emails right away. We have to be getting to these things very quickly. And sometimes email eats into our ability to have more time and space in our days to do some of this work. And one of the things that was really helpful for me years ago that someone said to me when I was working in-house in fundraising was that my inbox was not actually my to-do list. And I thought that was such a helpful distinction for me, that I had other project work, I had other things that needed to get done. And my inbox, the emails that were coming in, the things people were asking me to work on or questions that were coming my way, were not actually the things that I needed to prioritize. And so for me, being able to kind of separate those two things was really helpful clarity in being able to understand what it was I needed to be focusing on. So I mentioned meetings and email. Those are certainly important things. But I also think there's this kind of other general challenge we have in the nonprofit workspace, which I often call the tyranny of the urgent, which are these kind of fires that crop up that we feel like we have to address right now. We have to deal with these things today or like this second. It can't be put off. And you can probably think of some examples of this in your own work. And I think that that's something all of us face, no matter what kind of work context we're in. But I think in particular in the nonprofit space, sometimes there's some things that really come up. And so I think often when we succumb to this urgency and kind of give into those things, sometimes that prevents us from getting to these other important tasks that we may have in our to-do lists and in our project plans. I know realistically we can't be perfectly productive all day, every day. And I don't think that should be the goal. I think the goal should be figuring out a system and strategies that work for you, that help you make the most of your day, help you feel good about your work, and also help you really feel like you're making progress towards some of those big goals and being able to get that most important work done. So I always like to really focus on the idea that, we can plan and we can do our best to cultivate focus and do our most important work. And maybe that should be the goal rather than kind of perfecting our productivity and being able to be productive every single second of every single day, because realistically, that may not actually happen. So I want to talk about some strategies for how to plan for a productive fundraising month. And I think I've got, let's see, 5 things I want to talk about here. And so I'll go through these 5 things. And I also want to say too, if you have questions, you have thoughts on any of these, feel free to pop those in the chat. I would love to hear from you there. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and also your questions. This is a great time for us to talk a little bit more about, maybe some of the challenges that you're facing in your work and be able to talk about those here today. So let's talk about these 5 things. So the first tip that I want to offer you is to set really clear goals for your month. This is something I do as kind of a practice in my monthly planning, typically on the first working day of that month, whatever day of the week that happens to be. I sit down and I really plan a couple of solid goals that I want to focus on for that month. And ideally, these tie into bigger annual things that I'm working towards. I find that having clarity on a couple of goals or projects that I really want to focus on for that month kind of gives me my marching orders, so to speak. It helps me really focus in on what's important and really making progress towards some of those longer term goals I have in my work. I think one of the things that's helpful in this is to really be realistic with yourself. I think there's been times in my work where I've tried to give myself like more than 5 or 6 projects to work on that month, and it's just been too much. I can't get to all of those things. And I'll talk about why here in a few minutes. But really, we can't often focus on more than 3 or 4 major projects or initiatives in an average month, because we need to have time for other things that inevitably crop up, email meetings, things like that. But being able to identify what are those couple of things you want to work on. So maybe for you in your fundraising work, it's donor visits. Maybe that's a key thing you want to focus on this month. Maybe, just staying on top of donor stewardship. It could also be something like planning for your next big appeal, or maybe doing some long-term strategic planning. Really being able to identify those things and give yourself a clear list of what needs to happen for that month is really helpful. And I say that because once you figure out what those key projects or goals are you have for that month, it becomes easier to actually project plan for those things and go and look at those goals and say, okay, for me to work on these things this month, whether that's July or August, what do I actually need to get done for this month? What are the key tasks for each of these projects or each of these pieces that I say I want to focus on? And that's when we can get into the next part, which is actually being able to schedule things and make the most of our project planning. So that's the second thing I want to talk about, which is to actually schedule in some of your mission critical activities. I say mission critical because there's lots of tasks that we could schedule in our calendars or our planners. But I find it's really helpful sometimes with these bigger key projects that we have to actually give ourselves time from the outset of the month to work on these things. So there's a couple of strategies I really like. I like to do what's called calendar blocking, which is to give myself a couple of key hours, in a week or once a month to focus on a specific project or a specific task. So let's say, like I said earlier, donor stewardship maybe is like one of my big projects for the month, and I want to make sure I stay on top of it. I might do something like give myself an hour a week to do donor stewardship. I would just calendar it out for myself, set it as an appointment in my calendar, and know that that's the time to get that work done. Maybe you need more than an hour. Maybe your volume is different, but you might want to look at that and figure out, can you give yourself some set times to do some of this work to really make progress on those things? And I find for me, being able to make those appointments with myself is really helpful because it allows me to actually focus on those things and keep those appointments with myself. I've kind of given myself that dedicated time, and, in that sense, hopefully I can kind of guard it and keep some boundaries around it to prevent meetings and other things from creeping into that time to do those important tasks. Another strategy I really like around kind of focusing on, as I said, mission critical activities for your month is batching some of the tasks. So if you find there's kind of recurring tasks or maybe a set number of tasks in your project work where maybe it makes sense to just get them all done at once, giving yourself more of an extended period of time to just do it all in one go is sometimes really helpful. I like this because it allows me to just get into a workflow doing one specific thing. I think writing is a really great example of this. any kind of content creation you might be doing in fundraising, being able to just sit down and work on that in one go, for me anyways, and I know for others as well, helps you get into that flow and be able to just focus on that work and get it done in one sitting rather than kind of spending smaller pockets of time trying to get those things done. So I find that's really helpful. You might also want to do things like set boundaries with certain tasks that you find kind of take over your days, whether that's checking emails or meetings. And one of the questions I find really helpful to ask myself on a monthly basis, and you can check in with yourself about this as well, is, how much is too much of some of these activities? How much time realistically should you dedicate to these things? Can you give yourself some blocks of time for them, or kind of set some boundaries around some of this so that it doesn't feel like it's really taking over some of the work that you're doing and, really cutting into this other time that you need to actually focus on your fundraising work. So those are the first two tips. The third one I want to talk about is to give yourself what I call some white space each week. And I got this concept from a mentor of mine a couple of years ago that I found so helpful. She talks about this concept of white space in your calendar. So the idea is that we often need space every week to address those unexpected things or things that just end up taking more time than we anticipate. And that's what white space is. It's this like unscheduled time in your calendar to give you some extra breathing room for things that inevitably come up so that you're not packed to the brim in your schedule. So I would say in my own schedule, I typically like to plan for about, I would say 70% of my time in a week and try to leave a buffer amount of time for unexpected things that come up, new calls I need to schedule, visits I may need to go on, anything like that. It's really helpful to have that extra breathing room so that I can actually get those things in without it feeling super crunchy and really difficult for me to get everything done. I would recommend, if this is a new concept for you, maybe even just giving yourself an hour a week of kind of some buffer space. Maybe it's at the end of the week on like a Friday afternoon that's generally a little less busy. But you might want to find some other pockets of time in your week where you can just give yourself some breathing space and say, okay, this is time where I can catch up, time where I can do things that came up that I didn't previously account for, any of that. I find that often helps just kind of balance things out and give us some space to actually work on some of these things. So tip number 4 I have for you, and this is more about the week-to-week work that we do, is to set a top 3 for yourself each week. So again, this kind of comes back to this idea of granular planning. Once we set these key goals we have and kind of identify what it is we're working on for the month, I really like to sit down on Mondays and give myself what I always think of as the gift of clarity and focus each week and identify what are my top 3 most important tasks. So these are things that I need to work on in order to get to my monthly goals or monthly projects that I've identified. And I find this is really helpful because it just gives me some really clear direction as to what needs to happen for that week. And for me, I then try to prioritize these things early in my workday, early in the work week, to get them done to make sure I feel like I'm really accomplishing the most important work. And if any of you are familiar with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he talks about kind of the 4 quadrants of work, which is like important, urgent, not important, and not urgent. I think those are the 4. And ideally, we want to be working in that quadrant that's the important work. So things that are really important that we need to get done that help us make progress towards the most important tasks that we have. And for me, this is a really useful strategy to make sure I'm actually doing that work and getting to those things early on in my work week and early on in my days. And, making sure that other things don't creep in and take over that valuable time I may need to work on some of those pieces. So I find that that's just a really helpful strategy to kind of get clear about what needs to happen. And if you work with a team, one of the things that I've done in the past that I found was really just kind of like a nice check-in for everyone, not in like a micromanaging kind of way, but just sometimes on Mondays when we'd have our weekly team meetings, we would just all share what are our top 3 things that we're working on. Not to like kind of really hold each other accountable, but more just to kind of check in and say, hey, like, here's the things we've set. Are there ways we can support each other, ways we can collaborate on some of the stuff if some of our projects overlapped? And that was just a nice way to kind of bring this practice into a team setting as well. All right. So the last tip that I want to share with you is to set an end of week check-in with yourself. I like to do this Friday afternoons, probably like after lunch usually. And it's just a 15-minute recurring appointment I have with myself on my calendar just to check in and to give myself some accountability and hopefully keep the momentum going about focusing on the right things and continuing to make progress on my most important work. So there's a couple of things that I do during this short time. It doesn't have to take you a long time, but I find it's a really valuable and helpful practice to just kind of check in and keep yourself on tasks in your project planning work. So first of all, I always review the top 3 things I set for the week and just say, or ask myself, did they get done? And if not, like, what needs to get prioritized for next week or carried over into the next week? And if it didn't get done, sometimes I'll just kind of look at my calendar and curiously wonder, why didn't it get done this week? And, I'll look and see, did it get deprioritized for something else? Did I just run out of time? Did other things take a lot longer than I anticipated? Those are all okay. There's no need to be judgmental about it, but I think it's helpful just to kind of do some of that self-reflection work and think about what are maybe some of the barriers that are coming up for you, and what are some lessons you can take into your next week's subsequently. I also just like to kind of curiously reflect on the week anyways. So I like to ask myself, what went well that week? What needs to be different for next week? What are some things that I'm really proud of, or kind of milestones or celebrations I can embrace a little bit more in that particular week? And again, I find that, sometimes in fundraising work, especially if you're a solo fundraising team of one, it can feel hard. It's hard sometimes to feel like you've got momentum and to feel like you're continuously doing this work and making a lot of progress. But I find that sometimes just pausing and celebrating the milestones, recognizing the work you've done, can help give you that momentum to keep going, to feel like you've actually accomplished something and that week over week you're making that progress. I would say in years past, I have kept small little notebooks where I actually on Fridays will just write down like 3 things that I was really happy about this week, or 3 things that went really well, just to kind of give myself some record of what happened and to help myself be able to flip back through and see, oh, like I have made a lot of progress on this fundraising campaign, or I have made a lot of progress on our fundraising strategy, whatever it is that you might be working on, just to feel like you've actually moved from point A further down the line towards finishing that work, or really making some progress. And even if you're not a solo fundraiser, maybe you're more in a team setting, you've got a couple people working with you, or maybe you're part of a much larger team. I think sometimes being able to just kind of feel like you're making progress is part of what can help us find that motivation to keep going and feel like we're making a difference. Things are going well. We can handle this, and we can keep going in this fundraising work for our organization. So those are the 5 tips I have for you. I'll just quickly review those, just high-level bullet points. So 1, set clear goals for the month. 2, schedule in your mission critical activities. 3, give yourself some white space for the week. 4, set your top 3 for each week. And 5, set an end of week check-in. So those are the couple of tips I wanted to offer you today, and I would love to be able to answer questions you have. So I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes. If you have other questions or want to talk a little bit more about your own productivity, your own fundraising work. If you've enjoyed this broadcast so far, I would love for you to give it a thumbs up, and also be sure to subscribe to my channel to get more videos and weekly tips on fundraising. I'm going to be doing some more live tutorials like this over the summer, and would love to have you join me for those. So I am just going to check our chat box here and see what folks are saying. Right. Great. Megan, yeah. So how do you avoid constant email checking or having others assume you're always checking email or hangout messages? Great question. I really struggle with this for years and years and years. So I've tried different things on and off to manage this. There's lots of advice on setting boundaries around email. So one of the things that I do is I turn off notifications on my phone, which is really helpful. I never get email notifications on my cell phone. I have also in past years turned off desktop notifications for Outlook. So just turning them off so you're not getting those like little pop-up messages in the bottom part of your screen. You probably know what I'm talking about. So turning those off, I think kind of de-incentivizes us to go in and check. There's definitely some tools that you can use if you're not using Outlook. I know notifications are the worst. So if you use like Google Suite or any kind of like Google like Gmail product for your mail at work, there's a great plugin that Gmail has called Inbox Pause, where you can literally just stop emails coming into your inbox for a period of time, which I find really helpful. Sometimes I need my inbox open to search for things while I'm working, and I just don't want to see like the deluge of new things coming in. And so being able to hit the pause button for a little while to just kind of like, I would say like almost like traffic control what's going on in there is really helpful. You can also just tell people like, I'm focusing on things right now. I've got like a stretch of work that needs to happen today. So I'm going to close out my email for a while. If you find that, people are constantly emailing you, maybe you just need to send a little group message and say, I'm checking off for a while, I'm busy doing other things. I'll be back on email at like 1 o'clock or something. I have had colleagues in the past who have also given themselves set time for checking email, and they'll put like a little note in their signature so that people know they only check email a couple times a day. Sometimes it'll be like right before lunch, and then it'll be at the end of the day. So being able to do things like expectation setting with colleagues, if that's part of the issue, can be helpful in just letting them know, like, I'm going to get to it. Like, I'll see this at some point today, and I'll be able to respond to you then. So hopefully that's helpful for you if you need some help with kind of avoiding the constant email checking. I would say also it's kind of a muscle that you build up over time, right? Like I think our brains are so incentivized by seeing the constant new information showing up. So being able to kind of practice this over a period of days and weeks and months, I think it gets easier and easier to like get a little emotional distance and actual distance from your inbox so that you have time to do some of those other things. Great. Yeah. Great question, Megan. I'm really glad you asked that. Yeah. I would say one of the other things too, I know sometimes I have had issues with like meetings in the past where it feels like we're constantly pulled into meetings. There's just lots of things eating into our schedule. And so being able to really ask yourself, is it important for me to be at this particular meeting? Am I really needed here? And sometimes we have the luxury of being able to say no to things. Sometimes we don't. It's an essential meeting we have to be at. But really being able to be a little bit more discerning about what we say yes to, and being able to kind of set some of those boundaries around meetings can also be helpful, especially if you find you're just spending hours of your day in meetings and feeling like it wasn't really necessary for you to be there. So being able to kind of reflect on some of those things and set some boundaries around meetings can also be a way that we can kind of bring some of that time back to ourselves and put it back in our schedule for other activities. Great. Yeah, Gail, thanks so much for tuning in. All right. Well, I think those are the only questions we have. So we might go ahead and wrap up. I figured this would be a short hangout for all of us. So I just want to say thank you to those of you who tuned in. I hope this was really helpful. I'll be coming back to check the comments later. So if you have questions or other things you'd like to share, be sure to share them in the comments below in the chat box, and I'll be coming back to look at those. And thank you so much for tuning in. I hope this was helpful for you. I hope it gave you some new ideas around productivity and time management. If you would like me to cover a topic like this again, let me know. I would be really happy to dive into this more with some of you. It's always helpful to hear from you what you'd like to hear about in our videos and these weekly chats. So let me know. I would love for your feedback, and would love to hear your thoughts on that. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Bye.